Hey all, FilthyRobot here, gonna give you guys a Filthy's first look at The Last Spell, which is a game I'm quite excited to talk about. It's this is quite a mouthful. It is a roguelike, hero-based tower defense with RPG elements, and it's really unique and really cool, and it's still in early access right now, so I have a lot of feedback. The devs have asked multiple times in their first disclaimer message here, followed by bottom left over here and right over here with a big link to give us feedback, and I want to do exactly that. I want to give you guys my first impressions on this game and also the devs a ton of feedback about their game because I think it could be awesome. So let me start by describing the core gameplay loop of The Last Spell. It's broken down into two distinct phases, the night phase and the day phase, and then some sub-phases for that. During the night phase, you fight off via micromanaging your heroes and town defenses, increasingly difficult waves of enemies intent on destroying your town and killing your mages. And during the day phase, you invest the resources that you gather from the night, as well as resources you generate after each night, back into upgrading buildings, defenses, heroes, armors, weapons, etc. into your town to defend it. And since The Last Spell is a roguelike, not only is there within run progression, there's also between run progression. So there's extra difficulty levels, adding new challenges to the player as you beat existing difficulty levels. And then there's additional unlocks that become available as you harvest resources between runs. Things like extra items, different item types, new defensive upgrades, etc. Things to make the game replayable in a really, really fun way. So let's talk about what I really like about this game. I really like the diversity of options being given to the player. So one of the first things that sticks out is the item system in this game. So characters' abilities are determined by essentially two things: the talents that you take, which unlock often unique skills and patterns of play, and the gear that is equipped to your characters. Weapons in this game come with a series of moves, often with limited numbers used per round, certain ranges and certain styles of play. And there are dozens of weapons in this game of different rarity types and different qualities, as well as just different abilities, which means that each playthrough is often going to be a different series of things played together. And since characters can have two weapon sets available to them, equipped at any given time, you can make some really cool combinations with that. In addition, there's tons of gear. There's armor and leg slots, as well as shield slots, trinket slots, and consumables from bag slots, which means that you can build really cool combinations of equipment and consumables and talents to make really unique experiences each time you play. That's awesome. And it isn't just the items that have a ton of diversity, the characters have a ton of diversity as well, at least potentially. Not only do they spawn with 3 separate traits each time that are different based on which characters you create and come in different combinations, there's also, 12 primary characteristics and 18 secondary characteristics, and every time a character levels up, they have some assortment of both primary and secondary characteristics they can level up. Additionally, characters have perk points, which means as your characters level up in experience, you can customize the build of how you want them to behave. All these things lead for really interesting characters that can be heavily specialized into whatever you really want them to do. And not only are the characters customizable, but there's a pretty decent selection of buildings to progress through, as well as static defenses such as walls, traps, ballistas, and that type of thing to invest in as well. So what you get is you get a fairly customizable series of things that you can do each time, which ought to lend itself to really good replayability. Each run should be a little bit different as you craft these things differently together. I also want to take a second to highlight the interface in this game because it's really well done and continues to get better. Not only are there hotkeys for pretty much everything right now, between building construction, as well as purchasing and character selection, as well as character abilities when you have them, but it also knows itself here. A lot of this game is spent comparing items to existing items. So if you're going to upgrade your characters, which items you want, how does it go, rearranging to get the optimal loadout for that. And this interface makes it so good for this. So here I've opened a shop, and let's say that I want to decide if this medium armor is worth buying. Well, I can rotate between my characters with hotkeys, the same hotkeys that rotate between these characters on the combat interface, to see what they're wearing. And additionally, let's say it was a weapon here, I can switch between weapon sets. This character that I have that I'm comparing it to right now has 2 weapon sets. Again, the combat interface that lets me swap between weapons on the fly also lets me swap between that with the comparison. That's just really good because so much of your time is spent in these interfaces. They need to be fluid interfaces. And finally, I want to talk about the sound design of this game. It's just really well done. It's low key and kind of background when you're in the production and equipment phases of the game, but as you enter into the night sequences where you're doing the fighting and the actual defending of your town, the music ramps up. It ramps up in a way that suggests action and excitement and danger, and it's just a pleasure to listen to. You feel badass when you're nuking 25 zombies with your super powerful fireball or lightning spell, and it just matches the game really well. I'm hoping for a bit more track diversity on release, but by and large, I think the devs have nailed it with their sound design. And before I jump into my critiques of the game, the things I want the devs to do better, I do want to acknowledge they have an early access roadmap, and some of the things that I'm looking to have changed are also on this roadmap. So hopefully we'll see these things happen, but I want to give a bit more of an in-depth breakdown on kind of why they need to happen and what needs to happen to make this game truly great. Because I have all the hopes for this game, but we'll have to see. It's going to come down entirely to the execution of these ideas. The number one problem with the last spell is that the difficulty really doesn't scale appropriately. It's too easy all the way through. There's 2 big culprits for that. The first is the basic game is just too easy. There's too few things that you can do that will make you lose a run. And roguelikes in particular, I really think benefit from some runs essentially failing from bad decisions. It helps train the player on what decisions are good and helps cull out bad strategies that don't really optimize for the game systems being offered. And then the second problem is the meta progression. The problem with this is that the hardest difficulty right now is the base difficulty. Because as you progress through the difficulties, which you can do almost immediately, I'm sure it's been done. I haven't personally done it. I think it took me two attempts to beat the base difficulty and then 1 attempt to beat every other difficulty, which means that I got to the max difficulty with 5 runs or something, 2 there, 3, 4, 5 runs. And even at that point, which should be not all of the unlocks, I had already, every time after the first run, I had scaled harder than the enemies did. So by the time I got to Apocalypse 3 was easier than normal because I had scaled up too much as the player. And we're going to talk a little bit about meta progression next. And really, I think the answer to that is meta progression should be about options, about specialization and options, not about overall power level. So we need to not make meta progression be power level for the player, because then the problem is the player scales harder than the challenge does. That's got to be fixed because this game is intended to be hard. And part of the fun of this is trying out strategies and seeing what works and fine tuning your strategy to make it a little bit better. And what do you have to cut to make this next thing work? But the problem is right now, none of that actually occurs. You can do whatever you want in any way you want in this game and essentially beat it every single time. And that doesn't encourage replayability because there just isn't enough challenge there. The core mechanics are fun, but they're only fun when they're under pressure. There's fun in general to be doing this. The end result of fighting in this game is essentially secondary to the joy of the crafting of the strategy. It's essentially proof of concept, right? You build these characters, they're proof of concept, strong enough to deal with these threats, but the fight itself isn't so inherently fun that you're going to be playing the game for that alone. You're playing the game to see if you can beat the scaling difficulty of it, not just to play the mechanics, if that makes any sense. So this has to be fixed, and this is the number one biggest issue with this. And I know extra apocalypse levels are planned, but that only is part of the problem. I really think it's the meta progression. We're going to talk about that next. So let's talk about the second biggest problem with the last spell, and that is the meta progression system. I'm going to start with the surface level stuff, which is essentially layout and formatting, so easy to fix, but has a big impact on the player for quality of life. This system needs to go. So this is done for lore and thematic reasons, why it's split between this, but this split is essentially an artificial split that doesn't make sense for the player whatsoever. On this side, we have the purple things. And the purple unlocks seem to be essentially weapons and character development, and that's fine. And they use one resource, which is also fine. What isn't fine is this friggin' layout. This layout is atrocious. We don't need one giant glorified list that has all the things available at the top, followed by all the things we've unlocked in the middle, which, by the way, if you scroll down, only changes with that check mark and a little bit of highlighting. And then finally, this unlocks that are unknown, how to unlock them, what they do, how to unlock them, and what and how we might go about doing that. We don't need this. What we need for this, my suggestion, the first thing that comes to mind is a node system, like almost like a tech tree with nodes, right? So you have a node, and that node maybe is the weapon node, for example, and coming out of the weapon node is swords, and coming out of swords is more swords, sharper swords, whatever you want to do for your sword progression, so that we can visually kind of have a layout of these clusters and map in our head the things that we might want to do. So first of these is the format, and I'm gonna that format will tie into a little bit later how I think they should balance this as well. So that's the first part of this, right? And then continuing with this awful layout is this breakdown here. Now, this breakdown is essentially armor sets, unlocking different types of armor sets. In the same way that we unlock sword diversity on the other page, this page is unlocking armor diversity. But there's a couple problems with this, and same with the other page. First of all, these should be links. These should be links to what they do, not necessarily what a spiked helm is, but what does the spike set do? The sets in this game have certain characteristics. In the same way that on this other screen, these swords, like the various types, adamantium, mithril, silver, steel, these have unique properties that are what the unlock is about. A steel sword always has some base attributes that are unique to steel swords but different than silver swords. And the same with these armor sets. But we as the player, this is blind. We're making these decisions blind. So we can unlock this, but we don't know what we're unlocking. We don't know why we would want to unlock it because we don't know what it does. So these should be links or hyperlinks to let us know what these types of things do. Additionally, I don't think this should be separated. Think about it from the player mentality. I'm unlocking armor and weapon unlocks for my characters. Why are these in two different tech trees? Why are they in two entirely different interfaces and unlocked via two different mechanics? The stuff in the purple stuff is unlocked by killing things over time. That's a really reasonable mechanic. As you play the game more, you kill more things. That happens naturally. You get to choose which ones you unlock first. Makes total sense to me. That's fine. I'm fine with that system. This other system is pretty bad. This is a system that unlocks based on things you've done in the game, which is okay, except the things that they're having you unlock with aren't things you naturally do in the game if you're playing well. One of the unlocks, for example, was get a character to 300 plus health, but there's no reason to stack health in the game. So the only way I even knew to do that was it was listed here, which is an improvement over the other menu where the listed stuff is hidden, although this one's still hidden, but that particular one had some progress, so it showed me what it was. But I don't want to stack 300 health. I'll do it because I want the unlock, because I want the diversity of play experience, but health stacking wasn't a valid strategy in the base game. So I don't think this unlock should work I'm not even sure there should be two unlocks. I'm quite happy with the essence system, which is the harvesting souls, killing stuff, unlocking, but I think these should probably be merged into a single tech tree with clusters of stuff and a description of what we're potentially unlocking as players. And that's going to feed into the second portion of this. So the second and probably more damning problem with the meta progression system is that the meta progression isn't done well. So sword and armor unlocks, for example, to keep using the example we've been touching on, are a diversity thing. It's cool to have more swords as a player because you get more unique builds you can do out of it, more customization and fine-tuning of a sword build. Maybe I want to use the silver sword because it has some unique attribute that I want to stack to do some different build that lets me experience this game differently than I've been experiencing it before. Super cool. Exactly what the diversity of meta progression should do. We unlock new things, we can do new things and have new experiences while playing the same game. Everyone wins on that. The problem is a lot of these are actually power. They're essentially anti-difficulty scaling. So, the biggest offenders of these are things like the action point systems, right? So you can get multiple levels of meta progression that make your heroes generate with +1 action point. On the higher difficulties, as you play more, that's absolutely critical because your action economy gets way better. If you have 3 heroes, each of whom have 6 action points, your total action points are 18. If you have 3 heroes, each of whom have 8 action points, your total action points are 24. You've essentially generated another hero out of nowhere off meta unlocks. That isn't diversity. That's a must include, and it's just difficulty. And we don't want that. We want a difficulty system, and we want that independent of the diversity meta progression system. All right, let me try to give a second example of that, right? So, and why this is so damning is this becomes a must-have. I must always have this as soon as possible. And it means I'm not actually making selections anymore for what I'm unlocking because there's nothing as powerful as this particular trait given there. So what I would rather see, and I'm gonna give you I'm going to give you an alternate system with this from a different game that I really liked that maybe could be used in this game. So this is Curse of the Dead Gods. And what Curse of the Dead Gods has done for their progression system is they allow essentially specialization in any given run. So if I remove all of these runes, I now have 3 rune slots that I can focus on for this particular run. So let's say I want to have a lifesteal run, or a gold generation run, or a run where I specialize in 2-handed weapons as opposed to 1-handed weapons, or shields as opposed to weapons at all. Then I choose the appropriate runes that go with that. I still have to unlock them for meta progression resources, but I get to choose on each given run what my specialization is going to be. And that's fun for the player because it lets me say, I want to be a hammer specialist and play with the hammer this time, and I have the ability as a player to specialize to do that. And they do other things with that as well. You can like focus the types of things you might find or the types of things that you might encounter along the way to go along with that. But essentially you're tailoring the experience you have for that specific playthrough. And in my opinion, that's what should be done for the last spell as well. Because right now, unlocking extra hammers and extra armor types and extra short bows and extra hand crossbows actually prevent me from specializing, because now my markets are flooded with an extra amount of weapons and armors of all sorts of different types and not allow me to specialize at all. So I'm at the mercy of what I randomly generate when I create items to find the things that fit the builds that I'm trying to build. So it's the opposite of specialization. So not only am I then forced initially to take all the ones that give me just pure difficulty decrease, essentially making my character stronger relative to the content, even after I've unlocked those, I'm then stuck with this weird thing where by adding the unique things that I could do, I prevent myself from specializing in any given game. And I want the opposite of that. So what I think this should be, I think it should be 2 systems. I think you should essentially have some amount of points that you're able to assign at the beginning of a run. Let's say it's 10 points. And of those 10 points, you have all the difficulty things you have there. So you have like extra action points, more damage, characters that start with XYZ attributes. And you use those essentially as a customization, but you have a point system. So you don't just unlock these forever and ever and ever. You don't get an infinite number of these that keep stacking to make your guys stronger every single time. Rather, you're going, well, this run, I'm going to focus on fixed defenses. That run, so you have stronger buffs to your buildings. This run, I'm going to focus on heroes, so I'm going to have extra action points. This one, I'm going to focus on mobility. So instead of taking action points on my heroes, I take movement points, etc. So that you're still limited on the number of bonuses you could have, but you get to focus where they are. And then in addition to that, either with those point systems are more likely because those influence the difficulty, there should also be a specialization system, essentially what you want to specialize in. So a different set of points that say, well, okay, this run, I want to focus on hand crossbows and spiked armors, right? So you maybe have some stuff that ups the percentage chance that those things are generated relative to other things, so that you can't exactly fine tune that you're always going to be getting a handbow every single time, but you can focus on checking out the different weapon systems or builds to their extremes. So, and that to me adds difficulty separate from diversity and allows you as the player to have some control over what's going on with that without just getting stronger every single time. Let's talk characters next. This is another system where there's a ton of room for improvement, and it has a great core. It just needs to be fixed, the mistakes that are being made right now. So the first thing that bothers me is character generation. So your character generates with 3 attributes, and sometimes there's negative attributes that are mixed, and sometimes they're mostly positive attributes. But the problem is these attributes are often very specific, as in they're only good to some very specific builds. They're often contrary to each other, which kind of is like, if you have 2 conflicting attributes, they're essentially like having no attribute at all. And finally, are totally unrelated to the generation of character stats. So strangely, the meta progression in this game changes character stats based on the type of weapon the character spawns with. So as you unlock meta progression, you get characters who have extra stats based on what weapon they're holding when they're created. So, for example, we have better melee heroes. Heroes with melee weapons are generated with +1 movement point. I mean, it's cool that that's the case. We like +1 movement point, or we like +1 skill range, or we like better mana regen. But the problem is those attributes, that starting weapon that they have, doesn't match the perks that they come with whatsoever, which means that you might have a character with 3 melee perks who just happen to start with a ranged weapon, and essentially gets no bonus from that, making that character undesirable compared to a character who's lined those up. And yeah, I'm happy with the idea that some characters are better than other characters, but I would like it to be not as random as that, not as bizarre as being unable to specialize a character past what weapon he starts with. The weapon they start with is basically totally unrelated to the stats that character has outside of the stats that are generated with that weapon. And that seems to be the start of the problems with the character system. The next part of this is all of these stats, again, 18 secondary stats, 12 primary stats, they're not even remotely equal. And the balance for leveling them up is roughly equal. In other words, in this game, stacking damage was by and large the best strat you could do above anything else. And there's a couple ways to stack damage. There's multi-hits, there's crit damage, there's specialization damage, and there's just raw damage. But what you ended up doing when you promote, it wasn't, well, how am I going to build this character? There's some neat things here. It was, which of these abilities gives the most damage? Okay, no good damage here, reroll. Okay, this gives the most ability damage, but this character is already specialized physical, so we just have to take this one. And because your rerolls limit your options every time you reroll, what it ends up being is you are basically, the decision you're making each time is, do I have a good damage stat offered to me now? If no, if I reroll, am I likely to get a better one? And that's it, because all the rest of the stats don't matter, which leaves you in this really frustrating sense where you're only picking damage stats, only building that way, and that's the best way you're going to do it with that. So there's two things that need to change there. The first is the balance between the stats needs to be better. Defensive stats need to have a place in this game, or they need to be removed. And the damage stats need to be a little less deterministic. I'm especially annoyed by the focus on this. The fact that we have physical, magic, and range damage is cool. I don't hate that. I don't dislike that there's these three types of damage. I like different damage types. The problem is once you've started down the range damage tree, you're never going to go back to the physical tree because it doesn't make sense to do that. You gimp the character too hard relative to what it could be. You're just going to force range damage and crit chance and crit damage all the way down, or with some multi-hit along the way. Because what else would you bother doing? All the other stats are either detrimental, as in they don't help your character at all compared to what you could take, so they're detrimental by opportunity cost, or they're totally counter-synergetic to what you built on the entire rest of the character. And finally, the perks. The perks just are not balanced. The problem with these perks is, although there's a chunk of these perks, there's a fair number, relative to each other, there's just basically winners. There's some perks that are just massively better than others, especially ones with mana discounts, mana regeneration, so mana off crits, mana discounts, any of the action point economy things such as Night Owl or Energized, any of the ones that essentially make your action economy better are just way better than anything else. So you're stuck in this really unpleasant situation where although your character has 18 secondary characteristics and 9 primary characteristics and whatever the number of this is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 by, what is this, 6, 7, 8. This is 5, 6, 7, 8. So 6 by 8, so like 48 plus, 48 perks. Of the 48 perks, you're basically, every character ends up with the same 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 maybe per line, which means there isn't build diversity. You're just stuck in this horrible situation where the optimized play is always identical again and again and again, which means the replayability this game is supposed to offer doesn't exist, which is a huge problem for the character creation. So none of these problems are insurmountable. Each of them have some, I think, fairly easy solutions. And for me, the first one, the problem of meta progression defining your character's strengths and therefore locking you into a build before you start, I think can just be easily fixed. And that is, we don't want meta progression making our characters better. We want characters getting better a limited amount based on player selections prior to that run. The system of essentially focus for the run would take care of that nicely. Second, the problem of damage being the best stat. This is a little bit more complicated, and I can think of 2 real ways to do this. The first is if damage is always going to be the best stat, which kind of makes sense in a game that's based on swarming you with enemies. You have to kill them fast enough as they progress. As they progress in numbers and strength, you need to kill them faster. So you're going to have to progress the damage of your characters. So there's 2 ways to really make that balance. The first is you can separate out damage stats from non-damage stats. So when you level, perhaps you're assigning one damage stat and one non-damage stat. And that might allow some diversity of builds. So it might allow for a very mobile damage dealer, or a very accurate mobile damage dealer, or a multi-target damage dealer as opposed to a single target damage dealer, or whatever else might be like that. And that's one possible solution, is essentially go, well, if your player's always taking damage stats, we'll give them the damage stats to choose from, and then we're going to still want to use these other stats, so we'll give them a second selection for that. And the other way to do this is to build defensive-based stats that do damage. And currently there just aren't any of these right now. The tanking in this game is fairly weak at the moment. It doesn't seem to delay damage enough for the investment in resources you're going to have to do with that. And the problem is, even if opponent creatures are attacking you, they aren't dying, and you have to deal with them sooner or later anyways. So dealing with them later tends to be worse than just building a character to deal with them now or dealing with them sooner. So either the interruption that defensive characters have on the enemy's progression towards your town needs to be more, or we need to do damage based on defensive stats. So perhaps there's a shield specialist, for example, who uses block as a damage source as well as a defensive source, so that they are then a tanky boy who also is a damage dealer based on their defensive stats. But either of these things might help alleviate the fact that right now you're always best off picking damage and accuracy, or some other damage providing skills such as multi-hit, crit, whatever, or accuracy essentially is another damage providing skill, because nothing else is as good as those. A few other ideas that might relate to this as well. Currently the game suffers from the fact that range characters by and large are better than melee characters until right at the end, when you have enough equipment to essentially make the melee characters good enough to play. And this is basically enough mobility. It's a little bit broken with warp stones, for example, and it's just early game, your melee characters aren't mobile enough, aren't tanky enough, and don't have enough impact to compete with the range characters. And we don't want this. We want the diversity of weapons to actually be a diversity of weapons, as opposed to a ranking system of which weapon you'd rather have. So some of this might be, for example, in the same way that weapons give the way that attacks are structured, they might also need to give mobility, and they might need to be some restrictions. For example, you can't have a shield with a staff as a secondary weapon system, for example, because maybe you don't want your magic dealers to be super mobile, because you want the magic to have a restriction on it. So maybe power stabs come with -2 mobility or something, or swords come with +4 mobility. Some reason to use melee, or be able to effectively use melee in the early game. And finally, the perk system just has to be fixed. We don't want there to be best in slot perks. The whole idea of best in slot ruins replayability. It punishes unique builds. It punishes chasing different ideas. The perk balance just has to be better. There's no sweet spot for, or rather no shortcut for that, right? These perks need to be viable somewhere always. There always needs to be a build that wants to run back protection more than initiator. Always. If there isn't a build that really wants this over that, then this perk is useless. And if the build that does want back protection over initiator isn't a good build, isn't a viable build, or it's a worse build than the build that wants to run initiator, we're in the same problem. Then back protection just gets forced out sooner or later. And at the moment, the game is easy enough. That's its own problem, by the way. But the game is easy enough that isn't so much of a problem. If you want to build characters with back protection, even though back protection is pretty bad, you can do that. You'll still beat the game. But presumably, as we get enough difficulty scaling, what's going to happen are the weaker perks and weaker weapon selections are going to drop off first, because they're going to stop being viable. And we don't want that. We want to maintain the vision of this super diverse weapon armor build system, as well as still separately be able to increase the difficulty of the skill level the players have to play at, or the challenge of the decisions that players are forced to make, without losing the diversity of the system. That's the goal. Another issue I have with the last spell is the early game building progression. The player is too railroaded into the early game decisions, particularly the economy decisions. The fastest way to snowball in this game currently is investing heavily in economy early, and then building a seer hut basically as soon as you can. And that's because nothing is more powerful as an upgrade than having the enemies spawn further back, so they can't immediately move in and attack your town, giving you multiple turns to deal with them before they get to your walls. And then nothing scales your game better than a solid economy early. And the problem is there's no loss in doing it that way. There's only gain. So I don't have to give up anything to invest heavily in mines right now. It's just always better to do that than to not do that, because I will scale harder later and I don't suffer now. And I would like a few more of these, of the mechanical ideas, the mechanical balance that will make it a harder decision whether I invest in economy this round or I invest in something else in this round. And at the moment, there just really isn't anything else to invest in the early game besides economy. So in an attempt to be useful, I've thought of some potential solutions for this. The first thing that comes to mind for me is events. And what we want in events are something that makes each game a little bit different from the other games in terms of the economy interactions. Now, maybe this could be, for example, wandering merchants who come through with some sort of powerful buff that you can get, some sort of investment that isn't a mine or a building investment that might be useful later. Or perhaps this is things that change the way the enemies behave a little bit, like an extra fog night, where instead of just the fog moving forward or back based on your seer hut and regular progression, there's some sort of like forecast that this is going to be a heavy fog night. On a heavy fog night, you might be forced to invest more heavily in units that round relative to the progression. But you need something that isn't the same series of buildings in the same order at the same time in every game to make this different. And as a final commentary on the buildings, there's a couple other things that need to be addressed. One, the seer hut is just too powerful relative to anything else. It's currently both essential to your runs and better than anything else you could do, which is a problem. And two, the item specialization by building is inherently not fun. And what I mean by that is you are actually incentivized to have all three of your characters using all three of your starting characters using the same weapon systems nearly as soon as possible so that you can minimize the investment and resources you have to put towards buildings. Since the buildings craft based on the type of weapon that comes out of them. So the bowyer produces ranged weapons, the blacksmith produces melee weapons, and the magic shop produces magic weapons, and then the armor maker produces all armors. You're incentivized to build and level up as few buildings as possible to be most efficient with your resources, which means that you're always going to neglect at least one weapon system early and generally two weapon systems early, because it's just better to heavily invest in a single weapon system for maximum efficiency. I hate that. I hate that each run I'm basically penalized on one of these things. And I can't think of a solution that doesn't unlink that. I don't think it should be a specialized production building for a range type, for example, especially since there's not currently good early game balance between the weapons. Ranged weapons are just better in the early game, which means that really what you're incentivized, and again, as the difficulty scales up, you'll see people being forced to do this more often. You're just going to end up building an armor and a bowyer, and you're going to specialize in that because it's going to be the most efficient use of your resources every single time. And again, we're trying to prevent that. We're trying to allow the replayability of this game to shine, not force you into the same strategies every single time. So to wrap this up, I liked this game. I think it has some fatal flaws at the moment, but I think these fatal flaws are absolutely things that could be addressed. And if this is done right, there should be a lot of replayability and a lot of fun hours to be had playing this game. So I wanted to point this out to you guys as a game. If it wasn't on your radar, it should definitely be on your radar. And I wanted to give some feedback to the devs who've done such a good starting job with this and hopefully get the game to a shape that I want to go back and play it some more. So anyways, hopefully this helped, guys. If you did, let me know. Say something in the comments. Let me know if you like this type of video and we'll maybe do some more of them on the channel, and I'll see you guys soon.